We on? All right, welcome to the November 20th Shelburne Design Review meeting. Shelburne, Vermont. I'd like to open up to public comment. Any discussion on any items not on the agenda tonight? Seeing none, very good. I'd like to open up, are there any conflicts of interest on any of the agenda items tonight from the board members?
Not for me. Nope.
All right, does the public have any comments or concerns about any of the board members participating in any of the applications? Seeing none, very good. I'd like to move forward to the approval of minutes from November 6th.
I would make a motion to approve the minutes. Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. The minutes have been approved. All right, moving on to the first application tonight. Application SB 19-05R1. Application by Alain Youkel on behalf of Youkel. Thank you. On behalf of R&Y Northside LLC for site plan review to amend the approved outdoor lighting. Property is at 0 Northside Drive, is located in the Commerce and Industry District and the Stormwater Overlay District. All right, Ravi, you want to kick us off?
Yeah. So this is a proposal to amend the lighting plan that was approved back in early to mid-June. There's no changes to the use, slight changes to the buildings, but no changes to the building coverage or lot coverage that would require a conditional use amendment. Let's see, because it is site plan review, I did reach out to the Assistant Stormwater Superintendent, Dave Wheeler, and the town's Water Quality Superintendent, Chris Robinson, and they both affirmed that the comments that they made about stormwater back in June are still valid. Regarding lighting, the only thing that staff noted was about the sign lighting, while the rest of the lighting would be activated by a timer that would, upon activation, last 10 minutes throughout the night. The sign lighting would be restricted to from dusk to 11 p.m. Because that was not because that exception was not called out for by the applicant. At this point, staff will defer to the applicant.
Okay, someone here to speak to this application? Mr. Marshall, do you swear to tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth, under pains and penalties of perjury?
I do.
Excellent. Can you take this forward here?
Very good. I'm Dave Marshall from Civil Engineering Associates, and Revi basically did summarize the application. If you go back in time, the board provided an approval to the applicant based on what the applicant was asking for. It was based on a certain set of luminaires and a concept from another storage facility, and ultimately they were required to come back with a more detailed plan. Turns out that for that other community that particular facility had been used at, when you tried to apply the town of Shelburne's lighting standards with those particular types of fixtures that were used in Colchester in this particular case, you couldn't comply with the town of Shelburne rules. So we asked for a lighting consultant, Donna Lieben, to review the design as well as the town's lighting regulations, and came up with this particular design to provide compliance. She worked closely with Revi. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. And ultimately, the package that before you is a result of all of those communications back and forth. So at this point in time, we're comfortable that we now have a project that complies with the town's lighting requirements. And out of all that, that was goal number one, or one of the requirements set forth in the previous approval.
Okay, any questions from the board?
None.
Ravi, can you summarize again about the street lighting? You said it was missing, I'm sorry, your comments at the beginning, there's something missing?
No. There's sign lighting.
Yeah.
So sign lighting. So with the lighting on the buildings, thinking of all the right words, not thinking of any of them. So with all the wall mounts that the applicant is proposing, those will be activated by a timer.
Right.
After hours. Upon activation, they'll last for 10 minutes, and then they will shut off. With the sign lighting, that is not activated.
You mean a timer after hour or a motion detector?
Motion detector. Yep. Can't find the
So-
words today.
right,
But
so-
the sign lighting is not is not going to be a motion detected
Right.
with a timer. And that will be on until 11 p.m., which is the permitted sign lighting hours,
All right.
and then turned off.
Are you recommending any additional language in the applicant or what we approved tonight, or we're good anyway?
I'm good with it. The bylaws by itself restrict the lighting to 11 p.m.
Okay.
They didn't request a variance in that requirement. So it still applies to them if we do nothing.
By
Yes,
default.
exactly.
Got it. Okay. All right. Any other discussion from the board? Any other discussion from the public?
I'd make a motion to direct staff to a draft here somewhere. I would
Finalize first.
make a motion to finalize the record and close the hearing for application SP 1905R1. And I would make a motion to direct staff to prepare a decision indicating approval of the site plan review for application SP 19-05R1 with the following conditions. Zoning permits required prior to installation of the new outdoor lighting, and all prior permit conditions associated with this property still apply.
Second.
All those in favor? Aye. Very good. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, application SUB 18-03R1, application by Civil Engineering Associates on behalf of Elizabeth Whalley for sketch plan review of a 9-lot residential plan unit development. Property is located at 1348 Irish Hill Road, is located in the Rural District and the Stormwater Overlay District. All right, Ravi.
So this is a proposal for a 9-lot residential subdivision in the form of a PUD. This application was actually heard in a previous iteration late last year and early of this year, between early November and mid-January. However, staff did not receive a complete application within 6 months of the approval of the applicant's sketch plan, so therefore the sketch plan expired, and it expired on September 6th. So staff basically saw this as very similar to what was submitted in October of 2018, with very similar, the same concerns about that with the building envelopes that staff would like dimensions for the building envelopes. With the open space, now the applicant is subject to the current regulations regarding open space, that they have to set aside 60% of the entire PUD as open space, and their plans show 63.4% of the total acreage as open space. With some of the current concerns that were raised in previous meetings regarding trail access, trail easements, was something that staff noted that if there are going to be any trail easements, those legal documents must be provided at a later stage, part of this review. Potential stormwater impacts will be reviewed at preliminary plan review with site plan review, and then with landscaping, that hardwood shade trees must be shown on both sides of the private roadway. At this point, staff will defer to the applicant.
Okay. Marshall.
Very good. Dave Marshall from Civil Engineering Associates. Appearing on behalf of Betsy Whalley. Betsy's here tonight. And Ravi has summarized it well. We've been wrestling with the state of Vermont on the operational stormwater requirements because this particular project will create more than 1 acre of impervious area between the proposed homes and the driveways. We're obligated to have to get a state stormwater permit, and because of the complexity of this particular property and the topography, rules and regulations that were written for a traditional commercial development don't apply very well in this particular case. So we've been working with them, and it caused us to miss the 6-month deadline in order to basically get a preliminary plat application back before you. So at this point, we are working diligently to complete the stormwater design, but in the meantime, we were required to come back for, I'll call a reapproval of the sketch plan so that we can start anew a 6-month time period in order for the preliminary plat application to be presented back to the Development Review Board. So that's the background of why we're here again. That's on my nickel because of our timing in getting this back. This is kind of a muddy plan as far as as far as the property, but to reorient you, in this particular case, north is to the right. This is Irish Hill Road coming to the intersection with Dorset Street. And this is about an 80-acre parcel in which the existing house is located right here. Features that you see from the roadway, if you remember right, there's a large pond and a dry hydrant for the fire department right at this particular location. That's better. Thank you. So anyways, view sheds that you typically have looking into the property is as you're heading in the westerly direction along Irish Hill Road, you can look in through this opening into the open fields that are hayed. And in this particular case, what you can't see, well, as you drive by, there's also a wetland right here that's pretty prominent. And then as you move up onto the higher part of the land, that's where the existing driveway comes into the existing house. What this particular application does is seeks to basically preserve the open space by placing homes around the perimeter within the primarily on the edges of the wooded areas. So the goal again, as far as set forth in the zoning bylaws, the goal of the rural district at the time was to basically maintain open spaces and the view sheds and the beauty of those particular areas. So this being consistent with the previous review done by the board, the primary difference is that Betsy met with Paul Goodrich to basically try to eliminate the congestion of a shared driveway at this location. Originally, there was a shared drive that came in and then cut around and came out to this particular parcel in the southeast corner. She met with Paul. Paul basically indicated that this was an appropriate driveway curb cut with regard to that. So this basically eliminated some of the conflicts with the wastewater disposal systems in this location and a second driveway. So that is the primary difference. We've been working hard on coming up with the building envelopes and the cutting limits as part of the preliminary plat application. So we're very close to getting those things back in front of you. But in the meantime, we're here tonight seeking your input and the public's input on this sketch plan application.
Oh, am I right, Ben, that substantively, aside from the wastewater process that you're still in the middle of, stormwater process, sorry, really the only change is the driveways that you...
That is correct.
Any questions from the board, comments? Now, I recall we did have recommendations from the initial sketch plan. Correct, and I recall one of them was the building envelope in the south.
Yeah.
Right.
I think there were, if I remember correctly, there were concerns about the building envelopes for
Right.
the lots 2 and 3 that are on the
Oh,
westernmost
Yeah,
edge.
that's northwest, that's the northwest.
Yeah,
part.
because
You
it,
want them to try to move those to the
exactly,
east?
yeah.
That was this area.
Yeah.
Yeah.
right.
Yep.
Staff did have some concerns at the time about clustering. Something that is encouraged according to the town comprehensive plan to cluster development and maintain contiguous open space.
Okay. So Mike, I think you're the new guy on this one. So I'll defer to you for any questions or comments you might have.
Nothing that I can,
So I do have a discussion item, if now is the right time.
Sure.
So one of the conditions of all applications under the subdivision rules is that you provide street trees along public streets and private ways. Private ways are not defined. So the question we have for you is at what point does a shared driveway, for example, qualify as a private way? Is it 2 homes sharing it? Is it 3 homes sharing it? Is it 4 homes sharing it? The other thing to keep in mind is that many of the street trees that we typically look to have installed are in more urban, suburban type areas. So I'm not trying to get out of it, but I'm just looking for a practical balance of applying the street tree design goals to a project of this particular type.
Yeah, I would find it inappropriate to cut down natural trees to plant street trees.
And Mr. Chair, actually, the rules are quite clear. They basically said if the trees are already there around the roadway, you don't need to supplement that.
Good.
But whenever you come out into an opening where there are no trees, it does indicate that you should be putting street trees in. And at this point in time, what I'd like us to avoid is trying to do street trees along a single family driveway. That would seem fairly onerous if
Yeah.
you were asked to do that for your driveway after the fact.
Yeah.
Glad you brought that up, because I actually know that when I read through here. And it
So-
seemed a little bit prescriptive, I guess, in my opinion, like it talked about showing hardwood shade trees. And to me, I'd rather just
Do we have any
at
past
this
practice
point,
on
why
this,
would we
Ron?
be prescriptive like that?
So, one, in the rural district, this board has waived that requirement, finding that there are enough vegetation or that to protect view sheds, that street trees are not necessary, or also because of the natural conditions, maybe it's just too wet that street trees are not necessary. In this case, staff mainly thought the street trees would be necessary for the private drive that is already there for the existing single-family home, because that would become a private roadway if and when the subdivision is developed.
But it would become a private roadway because it serves 3 houses?
Yes.
So hypothetically, then, something that serves less than 3 houses is not a private roadway?
It's not a private roadway, but it's still a private way.
So is a single...
And that is up, you get to decide, because the planning commission didn't do that for you, as far as there's no definition of private way. So you get to define what you feel is the trigger
And do we
or
have
the
a best
threshold
practice?
for what a private way would justify this particular type of improvement.
So then you have two roads matching that, right? 4, 5, and 6, and then 2, 3, and 9, even though they're extensions on the
Yes.
roadways?
Yes.
I mean, to me, I think it's more generic about what are we doing for, I think the concern is always screening in this case, so I would be fine with just coming back with your landscaping plan so we can see what that screening is like, and not being prescriptive about what has to happen.
So the other thought too is, if you have a nice, easy road going through a field, grass gets tall, the road disappears from the view shed. Plant trees next to it, you see that road because you see the trees. So you're bringing attention to it.
Do we have a past practice on whether 1 house or 2 house creates, on a drive, creates a private way? Or is it an undefined term?
That is.
Well defined.
Do you know how many trees you have to cut for all these buildings by chance?
I'm sorry, Mike.
Do you know how many trees you're going to have to cut down for all the structures? Any idea?
I don't have a number.
Okay.
We do have a percentage that we talked about before,
yep.
which was in the 25 to 30% range. So, I mean, it is a number, but again, trying to deal with public policy, we talked about an example being if you were dealing with primary agricultural soils and what the state allows you to remove without having to mitigate, that's the 25% number. So, public policy-wise, I tried to make the leap of saying trees, primary agricultural soils, just trying to create a starting point for discussion on that end of things.
I'm inclined, as I usually am, to pass on the policy decision that planning has not made, and to encourage you, speaking just for myself, not the board, to, as one of my colleagues suggested, to come up with a landscaping scheme which you think is generally appropriate for the development. And, we in effect can get either closer or further away from defining particular sections of particular drives as private ways after we look at the landscaping scheme. I know that's not a helpful answer for you. You want to be able to design something that you know the board will approve, and I appreciate that.
I mean, we can do that, and we can basically present that to the board and see if that makes sense as far as what's proposed. And if it doesn't, we will hear about it. And if it does, then we're all headed in the right direction, I suppose.
So, I have a question.
I'm just looking at this, it's hard to say this is all kind of fuzzed out with the magenta highlight, but I think there's a lot of areas in here where it just doesn't make any sense to plant any trees. It's pretty heavy, as I recall, it's pretty heavily wooded coming off Irish Hill Road.
So Mark's correct in the fact that this particular shared drive that basically comes off of Irish Hill Road and services 3 homes basically is being cut right through an existing wooded area. So this is really off the table for discussions only because of the language that's already in the subdivision regulations. Really, the only area where this comes into play, this particular portion of the driveway is actually cut through forested area, and then it starts to come out of the forested area into the fields. So that's really the discussion point area right now is that section.
Right.
Where it comes out of the forested area into the fields, though, at that stage in the drive, it's serving a single house, right?
I'm sorry, I missed the very last part there.
It's only the section that you described where it comes out of the forest and is in the fields. That really just serves a single house, right?
There's a small section that actually services 2 homes. So
there,
if you follow the pointer, this comes out to the existing house, and then this is the driveway to Lot 9. So for that little section that comes out of the woods is where we actually have a section of shared driveway for 2 homes. If you set the threshold at 3, it makes it really easy. But we hear what your recommendations are, and we'll take a look at what makes sense in that particular section of the project area.
I mean, if you look at the charts, only from what I can see, is 7 and 8 don't really have, a ton of tree. There is some by the road, and then obviously the line going out to Lot 9. But everything else looks like it's actually in the woods.
One thing to keep in mind is I believe that anything that services, you can do a named private way if it's 3 or more dwellings that are served by that road, but if it's 2, you cannot do a named private way. So I think that's kind of indicative of, a not parallel town policy that's telling us that 3 and more, you can call it Hillman Way, or
I could be had by that.
2 and down.
It's got a nice ring to it.
2 and down, you can't, you
It doesn't
can't-
seem like it would look natural to have just a short section.
kind of contrived, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But I
So-
think we should let them come up with what they think is appropriate, but I just wanted to throw that in there about the 3 and up and the,
I agree
Three
with
and down.
both points. I agree with your sense of what makes sense. I also agree that we should ask you to come up with something concrete for us to look at.
So is that particular area, is that hayfield, of that questionable area? What happens there? Is that lawn? I forget. It's lawn, okay. Okay. All right. Any other questions from the board?
I got a question. I think this is for Ravi, and it's just kind of, I'm curious on the open space, and it talks about providing legal mechanisms, and you list different kind of mechanisms here. Are there preferred mechanisms that the town looks for, or how does that work?
There aren't preferred mechanisms. There are mechanisms that have been used in the past, such as open space agreements or deed restrictions. Even the property could be owned by the owner and still be protected as open space by some sort of restriction in like bylaws or covenants and the like. Most commonly, staff usually sees open space agreements for these types of regulations.
So the town does have a template for open space agreements that we would propose on utilizing. We may tweak it to reflect the special nature of certain portions of the property. For example, right now, the standard template talks about the fact that you can't have any mechanized equipment, or
Yeah.
not quite that way, but
Yeah.
for example, remember we talked about the shared path system within the entire neighborhood, and the fact that somebody comes out and actually maintains it for cross-country skiing. If you literally were to take that open space agreement and apply it, they wouldn't be able to come out and do that anymore. So those are the practicalities that we want to basically present to the board to basically make sure that you're comfortable with that, and the town's attorney is comfortable with that, and Betsy's comfortable with ultimately the restrictions being proposed on the land.
Any other questions, comments from the board? All right, any questions, comments from the public? Yes, sir. Both sirs. Take your turn. I have to swear you in. Do you swear to tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth, on the pains and penalties of perjury? He does, and do you?
Yes.
Okay, we're both good. All right, could you introduce yourself for the record?
Okay, I'm Dale Bergdahl. I'm an adjoining owner to the north. I have a question about the stormwater runoff. What is the approximate increase, and which way is it going to flow?
I'm sorry, your question was about stormwater?
Stormwater runoff, and what is the potential increase in amount, and where is it going to flow?
I can't, I suppose I could use this one.
Yeah, you go.
I didn't mean to take this away from you. So the state of Vermont requires that we look at stormwater at a number of different levels. They're looking at water quality levels, which are basically a 1-inch rain event. And what that does is the first inch basically takes the sediment loads from roadways and other places and basically deposits them in the streams. And what our job is to do is basically to trap and hold those on site as part of best management practices sprinkled throughout the property. And then as you work up in the intensity of the storms, we have what's called a channel protection storm, which is basically something that occurs once every 2 years. And what that's intended to do is basically protect the receiving waters from more frequent and higher peak flows so that you're not going to see erosion in those particular entities. And then we work our way up further to the 10-year design storm, where again, over a large period of time, it would be something that occurs once on every 10 years. We're required to demonstrate that for the 10-year storm, that there is going to be no increase in peak flows coming from the property. Sorry, I should be addressing the board. And then on top of that, this project doesn't qualify, but anytime you have a project with over 10 acres of impervious area, you also have to demonstrate that same threshold for the 100-year storm event. So in this particular case, what we're obligated to do is demonstrate that there will be no net increase in peak flows. And you say, well, how can you do that, Dave? Well, there are some ways of basically managing stormwater runoff from small driveways and making sure they have a chance to re-infiltrate the ground adjacent to the driveways. If you have a flat field, imagine you being a drop of water coming off of the driveway, and where does it go? In theory, if you have a flat plane off of the driveway that allows for sheet flow, and you allow for enough unsaturated ground adjacent to it, those drops of water will actually get back in the ground. But as far as those particular situations where you can't demonstrate a disconnection credit, then you're looking at some sort of best management practice that actually gathers the water, holds it, and then discharges it in a controlled manner. Ideally, the state likes to have you infiltrate or re-infiltrate water as much as possible, but that's only possible if your soils are suitable to basically have an acceptable depth to the groundwater table. So most of this particular site has a high groundwater table that precludes us from doing those particular types of best management practices of infiltration. So if you can't get the water into the ground to reflect what was happening under pre-development conditions, then you're obligated to put in some sort of structural practice to collect, control, manage, and then discharge in a controlled way those drops of water. So all of those things are part of the state stormwater permitting requirements. And again, because of the complexity of all the different watersheds and how they're broken up here, rather than, again, like I mentioned, a standard commercial lot that might have just one place where all the water comes and goes, this one actually has 8 different locations where water drains off to. So those are just the complexities of this particular property and all the paperwork that goes along with the decision-making process and compliance with the state. So that was the long answer to saying that our job is to basically make sure that you're not going to see a change in the both water quality and water quantity in the neighborhood.
But to address that from a process matter, you don't have a final state-approved stormwater plan yet, right? That's still a work in progress.
It is a work in progress. We're required to submit all of the supporting designs and documentation as part of the preliminary plat application. So that's going to give you, not only the board the opportunity, but also Dave Wheeler, the town stormwater consultant, the ability to basically go through and review as a third party whether or not they feel it is. Obviously, the state of Vermont is ultimately going to be the final decision-making party there. Sometimes towns' regulations are slightly different than the state, and that's where Dave Wheeler will say, hey, nice try, Dave Marshall, but we also have this extra hoop you have to jump through. So that's where Dave Wheeler's review is going to come into play, and we also have to deal with the master of the state of Vermont.
Dave, so when you're working with the state of Vermont on the stormwater, at the same time, are they reviewing the erosion and sedimentation prevention during construction?
Mr. Hillman hits a home run today. So in this particular case, what's the word I'm looking for? They prefer that both the construction stormwater application come in at the same time as the operational stormwater, just because if they're getting familiar with a property as part of the review process, they'd like to do it once as opposed to twice. So at the same time that you'll be getting the operational, even though technically it's not required, we can give you the construction stormwater documentation. You'll be getting all the plans because that actually is a specific requirement of the subdivision regulations. But as far as the supporting documents on how all of those particular best management practices are justified, we're happy to give those to you also.
Another
Yeah. Any questions from the board? All right. Sir, could you introduce yourself for the record?
Greg Forsyth, and I'm at 1507 Irish Hill, next to Mr. Bergdahl. You really already answered my main question. I was more concerned about runoff in regards to the new driveway, which is going to be directly across me, and how that was going to impact the significant wetland that's on that southern side of Irish Hill. But it sounds like that's sort of in the works and being figured out. Okay. And then I guess my only other thing was just a comment that it sounds as though since you're going to be cutting through the wooded area, there's not going to be any requirements for planting any additional trees, but I would ask that you please consider that in your landscape plan, the fact that there's going to be a pretty drastic removal of trees, and the neighbors would greatly appreciate planting of replacement trees. I planted 6 trees in my front lawn today, actually, sort of in preparation for this myself. So I would ask that be taken into consideration when the landscape plan is developed. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. Actually, it crossed my mind when Mr. Major mentioned, well, how many trees are we cutting down? So that is part of the program of, again, looking at what is being proposed coming in off of Irish Hill Road and how we can basically fill in any blanks or holes that are created because of just the conditions that either are there today or are being created.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Tree species, you all know about emerald ash borer, and there's a lot of ash in that region, and so I hope that in terms of your needs and so forth, that if there's a lot of ash going to be dying in association with the trees that are going to be cut, those are 2 issues that need to be addressed in terms of replanting or whatever, screening and that kind of thing. So that's something to consider in that area because it is a heavy ash area. And within a few years, I'm a tree pathologist, I know what's going to happen, and we're going to lose all of our ash trees. There's no question about that in the next few years.
Those are good observations.
Okay. Any other comments from the public? From the board?
I have a question to my fellow board members, and Robbie may have a view on this as well. So is the suggestion that we incorporate the suggestions in the prior sketch plan approval, or are we comfortable enough saying, based on the two discussions, actually three, that they've got our input and it'll be reflected in the preliminary plans without reincorporating the language of all those suggestions? And I have no view on that. I'm just asking that for motion purposes. Do we need to throw in the prior language?
So, so my thoughts, first of all, is that we spent energy trying to come up with recommendations last time this was reviewed, that sketch, and I still think those recommendations are valid. I don't see why we would want to withdraw them, so somehow they need to be referenced.
Well, I think we could do, well, because we may not have that record in front of us, we can say we incorporate by reference the recommendations.
Yes, somehow it gets
Right.
referenced.
Well,
correct.
we'll just say that we'll incorporate them by reference.
Right.
Previous sketch plan approval conditions still.
Yep.
Okay.
All right. Any additional recommendations beyond what we already came up with?
Just the fact that they're going to come up with a plan for the additional trees.
That's,
Well, that's part of the landscaping plan.
Right.
which is discussed in number 4.
Yep. So we've got that covered.
Gotcha.
All right, well, I'll take a crack at it.
I'll dive in. Go for it.
I would make a motion, or a move to classify application SUB 1803R1 as a major subdivision. I would also move to finalize the record and close the hearing for the same application. And I would make a motion and move to direct staff to prepare a decision authorizing CEA on behalf of the applicant to prepare a preliminary plan with the 4 conditions as written in the staff report, with the 5th condition that previous
The incorporation by reference of the previous recommendations.
previous sketch plan approval conditions remain unchanged.
Right.
Something to that effect.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? All right. Very good.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Other business. So I see we have a request by 3 Jules to extend sketch plan approval.
Yeah, so I received correspondence from one of the applicants, Jet Graff, late last week. I was out of the office late last week, so that was not included in this, but he requested a 6-month extension to their sketch plan approval in order to make edits and put together an application that meets the requirements of subdivision regulations.
3 Jules, that's the Zen Center?
Yep.
I got it. Okay. All right. So we need to take a vote on that.
Do we make a motion
Yes.
to extend that to 6 months?
Yep. Second.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Done. All right. Anything else? Any other business for tonight? Anyone?
Motion
Questions?
to
Comments?
adjourn.
Second. All those in favor? Aye.
Okay, so